Welcome to Pod Save the World. I'm Tommy Vietor.
I'm Ben Rhodes.
Welcome back. You missed it.
I know. So
Where were you?
I was in London, Copenhagen, Munich, and Berlin.
Whoa, I didn't remember the Munich and Berlin part.
Yeah. It was a tour. It was
Cold War tour.
A lot of Obama Foundation stuff.
Nice. Very fun. This is Grudge Week for us, Pod Save the World. Grudge Match Week.
I know we have grudges.
We have the Patriots versus the Jets on Thursday night.
We do. And yeah, your only night game of the year.
Bad versus
you have to
worse.
You have to coattail the Jets to get on national
TV.
television.
Aaron Rodgers.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I'm as a Mets, Knicks, Jets fan, probably roughly that order of the Mets and Knicks, goes back and forth. I obviously root for the Jets, but it's just hard to get that geeked up about Aaron Rodgers. It's like having Joe Rogan as your quarterback. Or something,
Although a very good Joe Rogan.
Yeah, well, I mean that's the thing. Then
It's just his attitude that's bumming you out, or is it the play?
It's both the kind of weirdness of it, but also less that, because I can separate politics. Like I don't want to be one of those people that has to agree with all my players, but it's also the late career thing. I mean, how long is he going to be the quarterback of the Jets, right?
Yeah, you guys love to get washed up Green Bay quarterbacks.
We had Favre, max 2 or 3 years. And so it just doesn't feel as legit as having like your own guy, because he's never our guy. He's like the Packers, like that's who he is. But then you're watching a game and he'll like fling some ball to the sideline with like laser like accuracy. And you're like, oh, it's kind of fun to have this guy as quarterback. So
he is really good.
He's really good.
Just don't give him a camera phone. Deep cut there. So Ben, we got a wild day here.
We certainly do.
We're going to talk about.
Don't give him a beeper either.
Don't give him a beeper. We're going to talk about these reports that Hezbollah-owned pagers were blowing up all across Lebanon in what is alleged to be an Israeli intelligence operation.
I can't imagine either that or it's the greatest pager malfunction in the history of
the world. All at like 3:30 local time.
Yes,
they all just went
let's
and
just
exploded.
Assume this is an Israeli operation.
Normally the cycle with these things is there's an allegation and then someone within the Mossad or Unit 8200 or someplace ends up kind of smiling to a reporter and it gets confirmed by Ronan Bergman or somebody like that.
Yeah.
We'll find out. We're also going to talk about, what more we've gleaned about Kamala Harris's foreign policy views this campaign, and then some interesting polling data that you're bringing exclusively to Pod Save the World.
Yes.
We're going to talk about this ongoing debate over Ukraine's use of long-range missiles and why that debate has come to the United Kingdom and their politics. We're going to talk about the 2008 war with Russia and how it's become a central campaign issue in Georgia, the country. And then we'll talk about the French getting a new prime minister, why Iran is hiring Hell's Angels, a coup in Congo, and the sports trial of the century. And it's happening right now, Ben, according to the British press, and how it could impact soccer and foreign affairs. And we're going to talk about the NSA and Pokémon. So that's a well-rounded show for you.
Yeah, we got that's a lot to cover. Yeah.
Get your veggies, get your meats there. We're going no guests because we haven't seen each other in a while. So we are going to go long.
A lot of work to do here, yeah.
A lot of work to go. So let's start with this breaking news out of Beirut, where, as I mentioned, there's pagers being carried by hundreds of members of Hezbollah started exploding right around the same time. Lebanon's Minister of Health said 2,750 people were injured, 9 were killed. There are some gruesome images circulating on social media of people with, hands blown off, nasty torso wounds. Think about the place some people sometimes put a pager and imagine it exploding there. You'll get the gist.
Yeah.
You got pagers blowing up in public places like supermarkets. The AFP reported that the 10-year-old daughter of a Hezbollah member was killed in one blast. Iran's ambassador to Lebanon was reportedly among those injured. One Lebanese-based news outlet called Lebanese Broadcast Corporation reported that the pager server might have been hacked and that server was somehow fed, software that caused it to overload the pager's batteries. I think they have probably these lithium-ion batteries that can explode. And so we'll see. I don't know. Time will tell if that's what happened, if this was a bunch of battery explosions because of a cyber attack, or if it was, an explosive substance inserted into these pagers before they were sent to Lebanon. Apparently it was a new batch of pagers.
Yeah.
Didn't know they still made pagers, but here we are. Hezbollah says it was done by Israel. And if that's true, I think the other question is whether this was a prelude to a larger operation by the Israelis against Hezbollah. On Monday, Israeli Prime Minister Bibi Netanyahu's office announced that returning displaced Israelis to their homes in northern Israel was now part of its official war objectives. Tens of thousands of Israelis are still unable to safely return home to northern Israel because of the fighting with Hezbollah. So this is a huge political issue for Netanyahu. This pager explosion comes as the Biden administration has been sending senior officials over to Israel to try to encourage them not to go to war with Hezbollah, not to open a second front in the war. But even like the members of the Israeli war cabinet that we all think are very reasonable, like Yoav Gallant, he was quoted saying, the only way left to return the residents of the north to their homes is via military action. So very hawkish statement from someone who's considered the least hawkish of that bunch. So Ben, I mean, I think let's just take this in parts, like the pager thing first. I think my reaction was like to be amazed at the technical ability to do this, but then on a moral level, just to think for a second, imagine you swapped the names of the parties involved here, right? And I told you that Hezbollah or the Lebanese government caused thousands of small explosions all across Israel, hurting bystanders and kids and people in supermarkets. How do you think that would be described in the US media? I have a pretty good idea. I mean, it's a pretty it's a pretty indiscriminate seeming attack against a lot of people who are members of Hezbollah, but I saw reports saying there's a lot of medical workers. There were people who are part of this sort of more political. This wasn't necessarily just like Hezbollah armed military wing members, at least based on what I've read.
Yeah, I mean, I think to start with on the operation itself, presumably, and we don't know. We'll read the Ronan Bergman piece, as you said. Presumably they would have had to provide these devices. I doubt that there's some, spyware that can infiltrate, this many pagers and have them go off at once. So somehow, whoever the supplier is for Hezbollah's pagers, that was
Did a new
compromised.
job.
And
So you're in the camp of like, there's probably some explosive device put into it versus the battery blown up.
I think so. I mean, what do I know? I mean, I've never run one of these operations, but
to be clear, my source was the Lebanese Broadcast Corporation, which I learned about today.
Yeah, I mean, maybe if they could do it remotely without having tampered with the devices, then it's like even more impressive, actually. So either way, this is not the first time that there seems to be deep compromising of Hezbollah's internal operations and communications. Whatever happened, it obviously confirms like a pretty deep reach for the Mossad and the Israeli security services into Hezbollah. And we've seen that pass with like very specific targeting of Hezbollah leaders. By the way, kind of the opposite of dropping 2,000-pound bombs on, a densely populated civilian area in Gaza. So there are other ways of, pursuing your objectives.
That's a good point. Like seemingly the Israeli intelligence can reach deep into their enemies' countries anytime, anywhere.
And we saw this in Iran with
including assassinating people in Iran,
assassination of the leader of Hamas there. But yeah, to your point, I mean, if you look at this, we know at least one kid was killed. That kid, that 8-year-old girl, was not a terrorist. We know that these explosions took place. They weren't all on military bases. They were in supermarkets. They were across Lebanon. I don't know. That should make you uncomfortable.
You're on a bus. You're driving your car. Your hand blows off. Then what happens?
By definition, there's a tolerance of. So yes, while it's more targeted than dropping a 2,000-pound bomb, it is still not mindful of the risk of civilian casualties and kind of terror among the Lebanese population. And it raises the question, like, what is the point of all this? Because yes, this definitely achieved a tactical objective in, degrading Hezbollah's operatives and its leadership and kind of sowing terror inside of the Hezbollah organization. But, how do you think people in Lebanon feel about Israel today? Hezbollah is going to feel like they have to respond. Yesterday, there was a U.S. envoy, Amos Hochstein, in Israel with the express purpose of trying to de-escalate the situation on the northern border with Israel. If the goal is to kind of make it safe for people to return to northern Israel, that's much better achieved through diplomacy than now Hezbollah is going to respond. And so these strategies, what we've obviously seen in Gaza and this, where is this all leading? Because Hezbollah is not going to go out of business. I mean, just like Hamas, just like the, Islamic Republic of Iran, they're not going away. And there's just this constant ratcheting up. And I just don't know where it all leads. And, if and I get, I see some people being kind of triumphalist about this, but just think about that. I mean, do you want to be blowing up, people in supermarkets with their pagers and on buses? It should make, should cause some discomfort,
Yeah, I mean, look,
never mind just kind of blowing off the U.S. entirely, who's been trying to de-escalate that conflict.
Yeah, and just so folks know, I mean, like Hezbollah was founded during the Lebanese Civil War in response to the Israeli invasion of Lebanon in 1982. So I don't think the odds of them responding to an attack from Israel with anything but aggression is very low.
Yeah, and for a very long time, they have long memories there. And look, I'm no fan of Hezbollah. I mean, they obviously, among other things, they were, foot soldiers for Assad in a very brutal campaign. To be clear, Hezbollah does not, respect civilian, life. In Syria is the place you can look for, including, by the way, Muslim civilian life. They were involved in an absolutely brutal civil war there. They've committed acts of terrorism in the past. They fire rockets somewhat indiscriminately into Israel. Sometimes they fire military targets, but sometimes they fire them indiscriminately. The question, though, is like, where is this all leading, this Israeli strategy? And it feels, and if you look at a lot of, we're like Haaretz stands here, but I mean, this kind of feels like Bibi's politics as much as like a military strategy, like we're fighting wars on all these fronts, and it's turning Israel into more and more of this kind of martial society that is kind of at war in all directions. And ultimately, that's not going to make you secure in a way that diplomacy would. I mean, successful operation in terms of diminishing Hezbollah's capabilities in the near term, maybe,
right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's a few thousand people, but like we don't really know who is hurt. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It might have been soldiers and members of the military. It might have been kind of like Hezbollah employees, to the extent that they have a military wing and a political faction, and they provide services. And it's just it's a complicated, kind of messy organization that
with
is thousands
and tens of thousands of members.
Right. That is like, it's not a state itself. It's kind of like a militarized state within the state that's also part of the government. So it's just a complicated thing. I'm like you, like I have no, like the Hezbollah blew up the American and French military barracks in the 80s. Right?
Yeah,
They've killed Americans, blood on their hands, like not a good group. You just have to question what are we accomplishing by blowing up, thousands of pagers in public areas in Hezbollah? And like, is this an effort to kind of prepare the battle space for some sort of attack on an organization that is, far closer with Iran than Hamas is?
Yeah.
Far more capability. I mean, the description you always hear is they have like 10 times the number of rockets.
Tens of thousands of rockets, yeah.
Sort of military capacity. So like, is this indiscriminate attack on seemingly like a civilian population setting the stage for a major invasion? We just don't know.
I think the two things to watch now are, one, how does Hezbollah respond? And, in the past, they've, fired a bunch of rockets and it's kind of been a somewhat perfunctory response, but did they try to, do something more this time? More rockets, acts of terrorism, that kind of thing. But also, I think you raised a really important question. Like, did Israel do this? Because also Israel's now kind of lost this, card to play. Was this an effort to kind of wound broadly Hezbollah fighters as a precursor to some more significant military operation? And the rumor in Israeli politics has been that Netanyahu might want to fire Gallant because he wants to have a major operation into Lebanon. If that's the case, and by the way, to do it right before an American election, like, let's just name that, because I don't put any cynicism past Bibi. Opening up another front in Lebanon, is not without global risk.
Massive political risk. And by the way, this happened, I think, as Tony Blinken was like in the air flying to Egypt to try to iron out the latest round of talks for a ceasefire deal.
Yeah.
So just again, the Israelis like showing zero interest in ratcheting down the temperature.
We're listening to America, who's been saying try to de-escalate things, try to pursue some diplomatic arrangement to get the population back in the north. That doesn't look like it's in the cards right
now. No. And so look, that gets us to our next topic, which is the fact that there's fewer than 50 days until the election, which makes me want to vomit. And assuming Kamala Harris wins, she will have a lot on her plate now. Maybe a fun little hot war with Hezbollah. Maybe she can add that to her list, her to-do list. But also, there's a very good chance that she will have a Republican Congress, and the most space she'll have to get things actually done is on foreign policy. So, everyone's trying to kind of figure out where she is on foreign policy, how she's different than Biden. To that end, David Ignatius at the Washington Post had an interesting piece where he talked with a bunch of officials who had worked with her, or I think just had been in like sit room meetings and briefings with her. And a few of the takeaways. One, they kind of describe her demeanor in these situations as being like a prosecutor, like very skeptical, pushing for more information, like asking tough questions, like kind of all the things you'd want. Yeah. Frankly, I mean, Biden was more of a talker, but he also served a bit of this role, right? Of like being the kind of attack dog against, say, like the military saying they needed 10,000 more troops.
Yeah.
So it's an interesting.
Talker is a good way of putting it. Though.
More speeches than questions.
Yeah.
One retired general described her as, quote, more hardline than most people think, which I guess is just sort of a way to make her sound tough, say she'll take military action. There was an anecdote in this story where Harris, I guess, pushed the intelligence community to review the language it uses to describe women versus male leaders in intelligence products to see if they were sexist or gendered in some way. It was sort of interesting. I wanted to know more information about like, who was this assessment about? What were they talking about? It's like hard to know without the specifics. On Afghanistan, she was described as having pressed the military on the request to keep 2,500 troops there and not fully draw down, but ultimately supported Biden's decision. They talked about her role in personally delivering intelligence to Zelensky, like on the eve of the Russian invasion, when Zelensky like didn't believe her, but she kind of pushed back on him. And then she is reportedly skeptical about the next thing we're going to talk about, which is this debate over whether to allow Ukraine to strike targets within Russia with U.S. weapons. But Ben, anything jump out at you in the story as interesting, or like, I don't know, they told you something about her decision-making style?
I mean, I think first of all, it's just a good reminder, right, that this person for 4 years has been getting the presidential daily briefing, has been getting the most sensitive intelligence briefings. This is someone who's running in stride, is not going to have to get up to speed.
Yes.
I do think on the hard ass point, I truly believe, I focus less on the like, will she use military force, which, as you say, is often the kind of political question, and more just so like, will she, hold her own in a room with, Putin or whoever, creepy leader she has to meet with. And I really do think that the combination of these kinds of stories, and let's face it, even some of these stories about her being kind of a tough as nails boss or whatever, combined with what we saw in the debate, like
kicking the shit out of Donald Trump.
Yeah, I actually have a lot of confidence that this is not someone who's going to get taken to the cleaners. This is someone who's going to be a pretty hard ass negotiator. You know, I mean, how do you like to negotiate with Kamala Harris? Like, so in a weird way, the fact that she has enough comfort in her own skin. Because sometimes I've seen, it's a little intimidating. Suddenly you're getting intelligence briefings, and so I kind of, this combined with the debate makes me think we should feel good about her in negotiations with Xi Jinping or whomever, right? I think the gender thing is interesting. I'd like to know what did they say that, I don't know, this ex-female leader gets emotional or something? But the reason it is interesting to me is that, because it also suggested that she wanted assessments on more questions around gender equality. These are not secondary issues. I mean, kind of, as bringing the U.S. national security apparatus is traditionally been a very, let's face it, like white male enterprise, thinking about, I know this could sound like woke intelligence briefings, but actually like it's part of taking a more up-to-date view of how the world operates, and so I don't know, I wasn't put off by that. If anything, I think it's, good to kind of press the U.S. national security apparatus, kind of think about whether it's stuck in the past and the languages it uses and the issues that it looks at.
Yeah, and interestingly, in this case, the concern about the use of that language in intelligence briefings would have gone up to Avril Haines, who was the DNI, who was running the show, who actually, I think, would be interested in hearing it and interested in making reforms to the workforce. In part, because like, I mean, the lack of diversity in the intelligence community has been a problem in decision making, but also in just like kind of basic analysis, like when no one could speak Arabic, no one had any cultural fluency in other countries. So yeah, it's like a well trodden problem.
It is. And if you think about it this way, I mean, in your own life, right? Because foreign policy is an extension, as Joe Biden likes to say, it's kind of an extension of personal relationships and personal dynamics. I mean, if you were trying to make a decision in your life and you only consulted like white dudes, like you would be denying yourself the lived experience and perspectives of, of a lot of people, right? And so I don't know, there's an opportunity of her, diversity is sometimes in the national security workforce, it's like, it's at the cabinet level. We have ex-cabinet official who's a person of color or a woman, but it's been harder to get that down into the bureaucracy, and various leaders have, including Avril Haines, tried to do this. So makes you think that she'll drive that kind of change a little bit.
Yeah. So you also have some exclusive polling, and we're going to put on our best Dan Pfeiffer impressions here and probably talk through it a little bit and see what we can learn about foreign policy in this election. So set the table.
Yeah, so I have this organization that I actually started with Jake Sullivan, now National Security Advisor, back in 2018 in the resistance days, and we've got a good resistance name, National Security Action.
I like it.
So tomorrow, nationalsecurityaction.org, our website, will be publishing this poll that we did to kind of look at attitudes. And we've been polling kind of throughout the election cycle. So people can go and look at some of the key takeaways there tomorrow. I just highlight a few things that we can talk about, Tommy. I mean, the first thing is that it's kind of funny, how all polls kind of mirror the broader dynamic, and that she actually polls better than the last poll that we did on this. She polls better than Biden on national security, which kind of does just tell you there's a mood music to all this. For sure. Trump has like a slight advantage, but it's one of these things that changes a bit when you describe the leaders, right? So I'm gonna make 2 points. One about, the case for Kamala versus the case for Trump, and then another about, Gaza, since we talk about that a lot. On the case for Kamala, one of the things that jumps out, right, is that Trump's best argument is there's chaos in the world, and everything's a mess in a lot of ways. But when you kind of describe her approach and Trump's approach, people are very concerned about Trump being a chaos agent, and Trump going it alone, and Trump cozying up to dictators, which, by the way, probably no coincidence that we've heard Kamala use some of that language in the debate and the DNC speech. But essentially, if you contrast, if Trump's strength is, the world is a mess and I'm strong and I'll fix it, the way to push back on that from a values proposition is to say, this is not, this guy would try to fix it by going it alone. He wouldn't work with allies, and he's a chaos agent himself, and it could make things worse. And so I think she's got, both the kind of values case of like, hey, I work with our friends instead of cozying up to dictators. I stand up for the things we believe in Ukraine. But also, Trump is kind of make him the kind of dangerous element. That's one thing.
So you think that she should just start yelling about AUKUS, like President Biden does sometimes? That's
a very, yes, you're right. Like Biden's case was the worst one to make, right? I mean, to be honest, I'm the guy who did AUKUS in the Pacific Basin and all these accomplishments that people don't care about. I mean, the issues people care about, like the border, the economy, terrorism, the things that could touch their lives, And even on Ukraine, like some of the interesting findings were, essentially making underneath, taking seriously, as we have on the podcast, that point about, hey, why are we seeing all this money over there? It's useful. What we found is just to point out that, like, hey, if we don't, help the Ukrainians stop Putin, it's more likely the U.S. could get drawn into something later.
Did you hear her talk about it being that he could invade Poland? And she made sure to reference how many Poles lived in Pennsylvania.
Well, there's that too, right?
Genius.
And the point that, the money we're spending is going to kind of U.S., manufacturing jobs, producing the things that are going over there, and the values proposition. Gaza was interesting because the depressing piece was kind of less people think it's an important issue than the last time we did this. There's this kind of diminishing. It's kind of not on the front page anymore. It's fallen out of the news. Not surprisingly, more people sympathize with Israel, but importantly, like a plurality supports some conditionality on weapons assistance to Israel. And like that's, and particularly, in the Democratic electorate itself. So what I take away from Gaza is like, there's less intense focus on it, but there's a pretty common sense view that like, hey, we want this war to end. And one way to do that is to kind of condition some of this assistance. So those are just some flavor. If people want to go a little deeper into this, they can check out the website tomorrow.
Did you catch the part of the debate when Harris went super hard at Trump on all her ties to China and like sucking up to Putin and thanking him around the pandemic? Just an interesting, like, that she decided to really go hard and be like, actually, you're the one who's soft on China. I mean, I know it didn't necessarily pop in the poll, but it was one of the top choices when you were talking about like the threat to the United States.
Yeah. And one of the important things that also jumped out from this poll is that people don't want to like go to war with China. They don't even want a Cold War with China. Like they actually get a little worried about the kind of militarization of the conflict.
Me too.
They care about the economy. Like they
Right,
care about getting ripped off. And so they want an approach that like the words that jump out because you test different phrases. They want it to be smart. They want it to be firm. They want to not get out negotiated. And so I think this line that she's used in the convention speech that's good is that like Trump is so these dictators know how to flatter him, and then they have him in their pocket. And she's going to be like a smart, firm negotiator. That's the kind of, it's not just about being anti-China. It's about being smart about it.
That's interesting. Yeah, I mean, so much of the stuff, when you watch a bunch of focus groups or real repolling, there's kind of a question of stated versus revealed preferences or concerns. A lot of people say, oh, I just want to hear more policy, or I want to hear her talk about what she would do to combat China. But really, it's like, so much of it is optics. It's like, do you look tough? Do you look like what you were saying earlier, like someone who could go toe to toe with Putin or Xi Jinping in a bilateral meeting? Yeah. And I do think like the greatest thing you could possibly do to, address that question is to kick the shit out of Donald Trump in a nationally televised debate in front of 67 million people.
Yeah.
So well done there.
And actually, and talk about foreign policy as it relates to your lives in the United States and as it relates to kind of broad approaches. Like, I'll work with friends and I won't close you up to dictators. I remember, Tommy, like I was talking to David Plouffe in 2000, in the beginning of the 2012 campaign. And I was like, we could make a case about what Obama's done on the nuclear security summit to secure nuclear materials from terror. And Plouffe looked at me like, Ben, like, it's like your AUKUS point.
Yeah,
like,
he's like, shut up, pal.
People don't, care about this stuff as important as it is. They care about they want to have confidence that you're going to stand up and have the right approach and care about the right things more than they want to know your like 20-point plan for X, region of the world.
Yeah, it was one last thing on this. I mean, I do think one thing Democrats have to do is try to steal back from Trump the identity as the anti-war party.
Yeah.
It's kind of shocking as a Democrat that, after coming up in the Bush administration, that somehow Donald Trump, who supported the war and now pretends he didn't, pretends to be the anti-war guy. I do think Harris tried to get at that by saying in the debate that for the first time in history, there's no U.S. soldiers, I think, active combat zones, or she had some very like kind of specific phrasing that I think.
Because there are some guys in,
right, there's some people in Syria,
in Iraq.
Yeah, in Iraq as well. But it was interesting. I don't know that they hit on the exact right line, but I do think like the sentiment is important.
Well, let me ask you a question, like, because you're looking at this in the PSA and Pod Save the World context. You can you have that crossover capability.
That nerd.
What do you think about, like, because I'm on the Harris, whatever gigantic distro list, and I got the like email about the Dick Cheney endorsement. Mm-hmm. And then I got the email about like the Alberto Gonzalez endorsement, who I'd forgotten existed. And I'm like, okay, I get on the one end the need to have this kind of big tent, but like, is that a trap? Like, would you be touting the Dick Cheney endorsement? I don't know.
I think so. And here's why, because I don't think she gave up anything to get it.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? On a personal level, it's like, I revile Dick Cheney. Yeah. I think he's responsible for some of the worst decisions in modern U.S. history. But I think it does it helps make an argument about the unique threat from Trump. And clearly, like, someone did some great work for Kamala Harris, pulling together like this list of 200 former Bush or Reagan era Republican staffers who now endorsed her. Just like a good talking point for the kind of Nikki Haley voter, the never Trump Republican type, who maybe is willing to stay home but can't quite get to pulling the lever for a Democrat yet. Maybe you're bringing those people into the tent. But it maybe is uncomfortable as.
No, you're right. I mean, maybe like, we've got Tim Miller. We know that. We got the bulwark.
We got him.
But maybe Cheney, like, it gives a permission structure to some people. Yeah.
He was in his spider hole. What was it? Where was Saddam?
Oh yeah.
We got Tim Miller out of his.
Yeah.
Speaking of standing up to dictators, Ben, so let's talk about Russia and Ukraine.
Ooh, good transition.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Dictators like Tim Miller. There's been a long-running debate about whether the U.S. should allow Ukraine to fire American weapons into Russia to hit targets there, with the exception of like some sort of narrow, just over the border airfields and things. Zelensky is publicly calling for this. Has been for a long time, and now the pressure is ramping up on the British government. So the latest round of stories about the debate, I think they're all stemming from Labour leader, British Prime Minister Keir Starmer's visit to the U.S. to meet with Biden last week. The British government has given Ukraine a missile called the Storm Shadow. It's got a range of up to 155 miles, so long range, very effective weapon. You've seen it used in Crimea a lot, I think. Apparently, some components of the Storm Shadow are made in the U.S., hence that's why Starmer needs to go to Biden and get permission. Sort of seems.
Yeah, and there are a couple of European countries that have said they would do this.
The French
and the British, chief among them, but they are uncomfortable doing it without the U.S. saying it's okay.
Got it. So Ukraine, so they want to be able to, use the Storm Shadow how they want. They want to use the American-made ATACMS missiles, anything they can get. Putin is not a fan of this debate. So the one quote from him recently, he said, this would in a significant way change the very nature of the conflict. It would mean that NATO countries, the U.S., European countries are at war with Russia. So pretty clear what he thinks here. He has sabered rattled like this before, but still the stakes are very high. The Russians also announced that they had expelled 6 British diplomats and accused them of spying. It seems like they kind of timed this announcement to express their peak. So Ben, there's a couple like important things I think you have to sort out here. The first is just the question of like the impact and efficacy. Ukraine has a limited number of these longer range missiles. Some military experts say Russia already moved their most important military assets out of their range, like, the airplanes that fired the glide bombs, for example. So there's a question of whether it would really make a difference. There's also just the constant reassessment of the risk of escalation with Putin, and whether he might respond directly to like US, UK, NATO installations, targets, whatever. It was interesting talking to Colin Call about this last week and about how they made the decisions, and his response to the critics who acted like there was no escalation risk.
Yeah.
His response was like, how the fuck do you know?
Yeah.
Which I thought was well said. But I don't know, like, what do you think? We're still debating this. We always seem to get to yes. Biden always seems to get to yes. It felt like it was leaking because they were maybe about to get to yes, but there hasn't been an announcement. Is this going to be a situation like with the ATACMS where one morning you wake up and like, I think they decimated an airfield full of helicopters, and that was essentially how they announced the policy change? Or do you think, is Biden still clinging to this? What's your read of it?
It seems like the U.S. is pretty ambivalent about this. I mean, because if they wanted to make a public show of it, the natural time to do that would be this Keir Starmer visit, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, so the fact that they didn't come out of that meeting and say, there's this change, that would be a deliverable and in the parlance of national security nerds. Shows you that the U.S. has some concerns. It does feel like it's trending in this direction. It feels like Britain and France want to do this. The pattern has always been, it kind of gets yes. Again, the argument for it that the Ukrainians use is that this wouldn't be, I'm sure what the U.S. would do and the French and British would do is say, hey, like this, you're not firing this at St. Petersburg and Moscow. Yeah, you're just using this to hit Russian military targets that are supporting the attacks on Ukraine. So airfields and, supply lines that go into Russia, which has a military logic to it. And so I feel like they'll get to this decision. And I think you're right. It'll probably just kind of start happening and they'll try to make it not seem that dramatic. I mean, I'm with Colin in that, like, of course you're concerned. This is like a nuclear power.
How could you not be?
That could, they could react with cyber attacks. They could react with, more, they already have reacted to these kinds of things with more indiscriminate attacks on civilians in Ukraine. They could try to cause problems in other parts of the world, so this should be taken seriously. I think the other thing that is unspoken here is that testing the escalation risk, and the Biden people would never say this, and but testing this escalation risk, almost like a month before the election,
days,
I'm sure that's factoring into the concerns too. Cause
I would hope so.
Cause again, like everybody focuses on like election interference and like Russian troll farms and stuff. And sure, part of what concerns me, we just talked about Lebanon, the two wars that, are most on the front pages and get the most attention in the United States are the key actors in those wars. Bibi Netanyahu and Vladimir Putin want Donald Trump to be president, so, kind of opening the door to some escalation in Ukraine that kind of feeds Trump's chaos narrative. We just talked about that. That's like the effective argument he makes. You want to be cautious about this too. So I wonder if some of this might be on a slower roll because of the election. Now, if I was Ukrainian, that would really piss me off because I'd be like, there's fucking Russian planes, that are bombing civilian targets, and your election politics shouldn't factor into it.
But they do. You want Donald Trump?
Yeah.
Because he's going to cut you off.
Exactly, yeah.
I did want to flag just the role the media is playing in these debates, Ben, because here's a clip of our friend, British Foreign Secretary David Lammy, from interviews he did on BBC and Sky News. Here's a clip.
As we've heard from a former incredibly serious senior military man, General McCall, in the studio this morning, it is disappointing that the action hasn't been taken yet. We've heard it from President Zelensky himself. He wrote this week, "It is difficult to repeatedly hear we are working on this while Putin continues to burn down our towns and villages." Isn't the delay emboldening Putin?
No war is won with any one weapon. That is the case.
But this weapon might make a difference.
So they're not going to get through the winter if they're being rained down.
Putin said,
Russian missiles
Putin said,
from Iran
don't send,
raining down on them from Russian bases.
Putin said, don't send tanks. We sent them. Putin said, don't send any missiles. We sent them. Putin threatens every few months to use nuclear weapons. It's totally unaccepted. We won't be bullied by Putin's shameless grandstanding.
Yes.
We will be bullied.
Yeah.
I love Lammy's voice.
Lammy.
I did just want to flag, though, listen, every time there's a debate about something like this, in Ukraine, in Syria, name the conflict, the media pressure is always on the side of more military action.
It is I'm so glad. It's remarkable because, there's liberal media, et cetera. On these issues, like the media is always about doing more. It's always about like, why aren't you bombing these people? Why aren't you giving these people these weapons? And, Lammy's like, right. There's also this sense, because we heard, because you could turn it the other way around, which is it was like, oh, if we give them these tanks, the counteroffensive will win, I mean, it didn't, it's not to say that those tanks aren't important, but like
a lot of them
there's
being
no
used.
accountability on the kind of advocates for escalation that they constantly say, if we just give them the ATACMS, if we just give them the HIMARS, if we just give them the tanks, if we just give them the F-16s, that somehow like the war is going to be won, That's not what's happened. And so like, this needs to be like an honest discussion. And the idea that people who are actually in positions of responsibility have to think through, hey, we don't end up in a war with Russia. Like, I want people to be thinking about that,
Yeah, and like, look, the fact that like David
and by the way,
Lammy,
the Tories didn't give him this fucking approval, So,
right.
So Labor is talking about going well beyond what's been done,
I know the fact that like someone like David Lammy, who's from, the presumably more anti-war of the two parties, is put in this position where he has to get defensive and start listing off all the things his rival political parties send over to Ukraine for their military use. It's like, it drives me nuts. Anyway, it's just a hobby horse of ours from all the time in government and all the incentive structures that are set up that lead us to more conflict, wittingly or unwittingly.
And then the media turns on the conflict and it's like, how did you get into this war?
How did you not win?
Well, this is like Libya, like Jake Tapper, like how many days before you'll go to war in Libya? And then, so I'm bringing back, sorry, I did that. But like, the point is that like, this cannot be done because of a media narrative. This should be done based on like an analysis about what will work, what the cost benefit is, what the risk analysis is. And again, if you're Ukrainian, that is infuriating. I get it. But ultimately, you need to measure twice here.
Yeah, and Putin using and
they'll get there.
Wouldn't help anyway.
I think they'll get there. I think they'll do it like you said, quietly, and then that'll be the new normal.
Yeah. All right, Ben, that was good talk. Let's stay in the region though. So we want to talk about a political situation in the Republic of Georgia, not the state, the country. So there's a guy named Bidzina Ivanishvili, is described as Georgia's most powerful man. He's the former prime minister of the country. He's a billionaire who made his fortune in Russia in the 90s, as so many did.
I'm sure there was no corruption there. Yeah. I'm sure it was all totally above board.
All above board. Yeah, there's a couple of...
I mean, we got some oligarchs who make their fortunes.
A couple good bets. Yeah, no, it's like living in Silicon Valley in 2006.
Bill Ackman.
Okay, so he's also the founder of this ruling Georgian Dream Party, which has been passing all kinds of legislation that closely mimics restrictions we've seen in Russia in recent years, like the foreign agent law, There's been a big rollback of LGBTQ rights, et cetera. So there's an upcoming election in Georgia at the end of October that will determine if the country moves further into a pro-Russian or a pro-Western direction. And pro-democracy activists feel like it's going to be very consequential. So this brings us to today, which is at a recent campaign event, Ivanishvili suggested that Georgians need to apologize to South Ossetians for the 2008 war between Georgia and Russia that was sparked over violence in the separatist regions of Abkhazia and South Ossetia. Ivanishvili even suggested that there will be some form of justice after the election for those who instigated the war. This set off protests in Tbilisi on Sunday over the weekend. And just for context, I mean, most Georgians blame Russia for the war, which resulted in hundreds killed and more than 2,000 wounded, though, according to independent observers, journalists, an independent fact-finding mission set up by the EU, the war was instigated by Georgians, but they also found this fact-finding commission that Russia went way beyond the reasonable limits of defense. And just, it's like a 5-day war that I think 100,000 people were displaced, thousands killed. I mean, it was really grisly. So, Ben, I mean, stepping back, like this kind of political debate for a country like Georgia or a country in the region like Ukraine about whether to get closer to the West or to get closer to Russia is something that's very familiar now. We've seen it, again, we saw it in Ukraine over the years, other places. But this one kind of gave me whiplash because Georgia was so pro-America after the fall of the Soviet Union, like through the Bush administration, through the Obama years. And to see, these kind of leaders now demagoguing the 2008 war with Russia in advance of an election was kind of head spinning. I just wondered if you have thoughts on what's happening.
Yeah, huge right things going on. And first of all, the president of Georgia at the time, or the leader of Georgia at the time of that war was Saakashvili, who was kind of like the John McCain, hero of the American national security establishment.
Right, the neocons.
But like, let's be clear, in addition to the loss of life, Russia basically de facto occupies Abkhazia and South Ossetia, these two territories of Georgia. It's kind of these frozen conflict areas where I think Russia recognizes them as independent republics. And, what I think is happening is that underneath the, posturing, there's a rationality to people that might vote for the Georgia Dream Party. I don't agree with them, but it's essentially that, like, you know what? We might as well just accommodate ourselves to the Russians, because if we don't, we're going to end up like Ukraine. And, if we elect some pro-Western, pro-democracy leader, they'll invade our country and it'll be worse. And so, I may not like it, but I'd rather just kind of have a Putin crony running this place, and maybe then they'll leave us alone, So I think we have to not dismiss that as a crazy, thing for someone to think. I think the question is, as someone who favors democracy, and obviously we've had, Georgian protesters on this podcast, what does the West offer here? Because the part of the challenge is, they're not going to get NATO membership.
Right.
They're not are they going to be in the EU? Like what?
I think they're a candidate for membership.
What's what's the alternative here? And so, if you truly want to kind of fortify Georgia and give an argument to people that support democracy, they're going to have to be like on the same fast track for EU membership as Ukraine. They're going to have to be kind of brought closer into Western institutions, because otherwise you're asking these people every few years, every time there's an election, to kind of risk the Russians, invading their country again for no benefit in return. Like, that's the main thing. The other thing I'd watch too is if Trump wins. Like, Georgia is a place, Georgia, Moldova, everybody talks about invading Poland. I mean, these are much more likely the places where Russia might want to flex its muscles.
Yeah, I mean, we're talking about a tiny country. It's like 3 to 4 million people. They were completely outgunned by the Russian military. Right. I mean, they're sort of at the mercy of.
But geographically important and, historically important. Right. This is going to be a really interesting election.
Yes, for sure. Quick update on France, Ben. So listeners probably remember back in July, we talked about the French elections a lot. There were 2 rounds. There was the first round. It looked like the far right was going to sweep and possibly take power. But then in the second round of voting, the non-far right-wing parties banded together to stop National Rally, That's the name of this far-right party, and Marine Le Pen, its leader. Under the French system, the French president, President Macron, appoints a prime minister. Initially, the far-left coalition of parties had insisted they had won the most seats and that they should be represented in the PM spot. But long story short, Macron basically hated the representatives of the far-left party, and there's some dispute over whether they'd really won the most seats. So there were weeks and weeks of deliberations and dithering and floats of possible prime ministers' names, which were immediately killed in the press. And it was this sort of like kind of crazy thing that played out in the media over in France. Well, what you need to know is that finally, after weeks and weeks of this, Macron appointed a 73-year-old member of the traditional conservative party named Michel Barnier. So this guy is kind of like, imagine a Mitt Romney Republican in the U.S., sort of like his party. Barnier, though, doesn't seem to be a big fan of Macron. He didn't even thank him in his first speech as prime minister. An overwhelming majority of French voters think that he's not going to last very long because the other parties can call a vote of no confidence. But for now, I guess, stabilité, like, I don't know, this is just like a short-term mess until the 27 election?
Kind of, there's a lame duck kind of smell around Macron. I mean, the 7-dimensional chess he did succeeded in keeping the far right out of power. That's the bottom line and headline. That's the good news. But, if I was a French voter, I didn't vote for this guy. I mean, nobody was like.
They got like 47 seats. The Republicans. I think.
This is not, So I kind of, obviously Macron was uncomfortable with the kind of farther left there. I was thinking the opportunity for the left is that, how instead of the far right grabbing the cynicism of the electorate, I think there's an opportunity for the left to say, wait a second, the French people hold the Macron and the right accountable for the things that people are mad about, and then maybe try to come up with a more mainstream center-left candidate, or leftist candidate, but not one who's like, to burn it all down.
Yeah, Mélenchon.
Exactly. And so that the positioning is about the next president of France, I think. But French politics is probably gonna be a pretty dysfunctional place for the next couple of years, but at least it won't be a place run by a bunch of far right lunatics.
Did you see that Macron got booed at the closing ceremony for the Paralympics?
That's rough, man. When the Paralympians are,
especially after like a really successful Olympics and Paralympics, and they just booed.
I mean, I don't know. Whoever the fuck was in charge of the Olympics should run for president, because that was the best Olympics I've ever seen.
Well done, very well done, French people. Okay, another story for us, Ben. So last week, the Washington Post had this fascinating piece about how Iran has been hiring gang members, a Russian mob network known as Thieves in Law, and even members of the Hells Angels to threaten and even try to kill its enemies abroad. Often people who are just critics of the regime, people in the media. This technique or this strategy by them gives Iran plausible deniability, but it also makes it much harder for intelligence agencies or law enforcement to track and prevent these kinds of attacks, because you're not looking at some IRGC agent who has been on your radar screen for decades coming to the UK to do something terrible. It's like a bunch of criminals who live in Eastern Europe coming, hurting somebody, flying out. So the Post pointed to data published by a think tank called the Washington Institute that found that there were 88 assassinations, abductions, and other violent plots linked to Iran over the past 5 years, exceeding the total for the preceding 4 decades following the 1979 revolution. And at least 14 of those recent cases involved criminal organizations. Interestingly, Ben, this story referenced a plot from back in 2011 where, when we were in the White House, it was to assassinate the Saudi ambassador at Cafe Milano. It's like this ritzy place in Georgetown. That plot unraveled because the Iranians...
DC loved it because they were the center of the attention.
Yes, they did. And the Iranians, I guess, according to the report, they hired the relative of some Iranian official, I assume an IRGC goon, who lived in Texas and was like a used car dealer who's just like a hapless idiot. So this whole thing fell apart. It got busted up, whatever. But
it always felt to me like a no bad idea in a brainstorm kind of IRGC meeting, like I just don't think they were going to assassinate. Well, anyway.
Well, I remember scoffing at it at the time with you and since probably on the show. But apparently that disaster led to the Iranians looking back to deepen their partnership with these criminal gangs and drug dealers, because at least they were competent. And anyway, amazing reporting by the Post. I highly recommend reading in full because there's just like a lot we didn't get into here. But I guess my takeaway from it was to take even more seriously these threats by Iran to go after people like, former Trump officials, John Bolton, Mike Pompeo, who at least those guys are lucky enough to have resources to help protect against, the worst thing happening. But if you're a dissident in London, for example, or even in the US, I mean, you're just, this is pretty scary stuff.
Yeah. I mean, another takeaway I had too, is it kind of speaks to the growing relationship between Russia and Iran, in part because like the Russians have been doing this for a long time. They've got these kind of crazy motorcycle gangs and that they use in other, parts of Eastern Europe and stuff. And so it's just a tactic that felt like taken from a Russian playbook, to kind of enlist goons like this. It also kind of speaks to the hypocrisy of the Islamic Republic regime that, a country that has like a morality police at home that like won't let women uncover their hair. Or, I mean, the Hells Angels are not like passing the exam of the morality police,
nor the drug dealers.
There's a hypocrisy angle that could probably be messaged back into Iran. I'm not saying it'd make a huge headway there, but it just shows you these guys are full of shit. But it also, lastly, speaks to what we've seen is like a global trend of this stuff. I mean, we've talked about the Indian government like targeting people in other countries. We've talked about the Rwandan government targeting people in other countries. Like this norm against, targeting people. Well, we just talked about pagers exploding in Lebanon, I mean, so that norm seems to be breaking down, let's just say.
Yeah, and I guess, sort of our lefty critics of U.S. foreign policy in particular would say, well, in the 80s, the CIA was working with the Nicaraguan Contra rebels who were doing drone attacks. Or, there's all these reports that the CIA was trying to work with American mobsters to take out Castro because they had a bunch of financial interests in Cuba that were wiped away during the revolution. So there's, I guess, a lot of hypocrisy.
All directions.
A lot of best practices.
Yeah, all directions.
Real quick, we're inserting this after we've just finished the recording. We just finished our Discord questions, and Ben just read the following headline out loud that we want to insert now into the pod to show how right we were.
A new batch of Taiwanese-made pagers, the pagers which Hezbollah had ordered from Gold Apollo in Taiwan, had been tampered with before they reached Lebanon. So I was right about that one too.
It.
Yeah, nailed that too.
So would they say there were explosives put in them?
Yeah, most were the company's AP924 model, and they had been tampered with. The explosive material, as little as 1 to 2 ounces, was implanted next to the battery in each pager, two of the officials said.
God.
A switch was also embedded that could be triggered. Boy, these guys had a lot to get off their chest here.
Yeah. Okay, end of post-recording insertion of context.
Yeah.
Great story.
I just do wonder
Amazing
about the
reporting.
Hells Angels guys who are like, on the Islamic Republic's payroll. It's kind of a...
Yeah, how do you get
what
linked
a
up?
world.
Is there like a mobster Tinder? Like, how do you find
It feels like a Netflix show or something. I don't know.
That is a good idea.
FX show.
You should pitch that. Like tomorrow. We should erase this.
We should have like a lot of IP out of this podcast.
Yeah, how do we do that?
Yeah.
We'll figure that out after, I guess.
Yeah. You're you run this place.
Well, I mean, in name only.
Okay. Figurehead.
Okay, if you think the Hells Angels story was crazy, I think the craziest story of the week, though, is out of the Democratic Republic of Congo.
Yes.
So here's the backstory. 37 people, including 3 Americans, were sentenced to death for a failed coup attempt that took place in May. I think we talked about this at the time. This coup was led by a fringe opposition leader named Christian Malanga. He actually live streamed the coup attempt. And was later shot dead for, quote, resisting arrest. I don't know. Yeah. Whatever.
Make what you will of that.
Don't live stream your coup.
Yeah.
Here's where it gets crazy, though. So there were 3 Americans who were arrested. One was Marcel Malanga, Christian Malanga's son. And then there was Marcel's high school football buddy, this kid from Utah, Tyler Thompson. And then someone who was older, who was like a business associate of the Malanga senior. Tyler Thompson's family says that Tyler only went to the DRC because he was told it was some combination of either a family vacation or a service trip to build wells. And according to the Associated Press, other teammates, they're all on the same football team, other teammates said that Marcel Malanga had offered them money to come work in the DRC on some sort of security job, like up to $100,000. So it seems like several people were invited to come on this trip under false pretenses. However, once they arrived, Marcel Malanga said his father had threatened to kill him and Tyler Thompson if they did not participate in this coup attempt. So this is what he testified to the court, I believe. So he's basically saying, my dad told me and my buddy to come over here and then forced us to participate in this coup. Crazy. So as of a couple of days ago, the State Department had not declared these Americans to be wrongly detained, which at least at the moment makes it seem unlikely that the U.S. would try to negotiate their return. These Americans are going to have a chance to appeal the verdict, but if the sentence stands, they could be executed by firing squad. So, Ben, what a fucking nightmare. Imagine you thought you were going to like on a service project trip.
Yeah.
You know, and all of a sudden you're doing a coup. You have to think the U.S. government, like, well, first of all, we don't know if this story is true. These kids could be lying to the family, but it seems like there's a body of evidence.
It seemed kind of weird that particularly not the son, but the son's like high school. I mean, do you ever have a high school buddy try to talk into doing something kind of dumb, you know, like
all the time.
But
usually I acquiesced.
I may have been the guy. I never tried to do a coup though.
No coups.
It does seem unlikely though that this guy would go to do a coup. But also there's a judgment issue that should not get you arrested and potentially killed. But like, it's kind of random. Like, oh, I'm just going to go to the DRC. It's just kind of not the kind of place you think to go with your high school buddies. But I think the U.S. government, you know, should at least try to get at the facts of what happened here, you know, because if what these kids are saying is true, which is kind of believable, like maybe it's like this guy, his dad is, you know, this kind of big talker and he's like, oh, we can get a job or do something and have an adventure. And then the next thing you know, you're live streaming the coup. I think the job one is kind of try to figure out the facts. And then if the facts are that these kids are not, or, you know, that they're not lying, they're telling the truth. Yeah, I mean, then I think you try to negotiate something. But man, I mean, be careful about who you mix up with here.
Wild story.
Yeah, it's a wild story.
A few lighter things to close.
And the coup was wild too. It was like, it was not that many people.
It was like dozens of people.
It was like a few dozen people. Just,
what were they thinking?
Yeah, it was not a good idea.
A couple more things, Ben. So the first is a huge story in the soccer world. So this week was the beginning of an independent hearing looking into alleged breaches of the British Premier League's financial regulations by a team called Manchester City. So for those who are not big soccer fans, in recent years, Man City has been the best of the best. They've won the Premier League championship a couple times. They won the Champions League. It means they were the best team in the top league in the UK. And then at 1 year, the best team in all of Europe. So it's just nasty.
Yeah.
And the question is, if they got that good by cheating, and that's what this inquiry is looking at. So here's the gist of the allegation. So the Premier League has in place rules that are designed to make it so that teams can only spend what they earn. The idea being the league doesn't want some super rich owner, in this case, you know, a foreign country, coming in and buying up all the best players and spending in a way that no one else can afford, and then just dominating. Even though they're losing money, they're just dominating the league, but they're just losing hundreds of millions of dollars every year. It's supposed to be like a fair play kind of setup. Man City is accused of trying to get around these rules by not reporting accurate financial information, not disclosing payments to players or managers, underreporting losses, and then refusing to cooperate with the investigation. So these allegations are alleged to have happened between 2009 and 2018. And what's interesting about this for us, Worldos here, is in 2008, the team was bought by a member of the royal family in the UAE, who is also the deputy prime minister. So there's like a state actor buying the team, seemingly cheating to great success. The secret trial by, you know, soccer goes on for 10 weeks. They didn't even disclose the location. It's that secret. The British press is calling it the sports trial of the century. Shout out OJ, who also was involved in sports last time I checked. Yeah. Anyway.
That was last century.
That was, yeah. God, that's fucked up. Anyway, the punishment could include.
Someone get Jeff Toobin on this one.
Yeah. I'm reading his book. There could be huge fines. You could even see Man City relegated. So what that means is you're sent down to a lower league. So imagine the New York Yankees cheating.
It's like Ted Lasso, you know?
Yeah, and getting sent down to AAA baseball.
Yeah.
Crazy. Anyway, huge implications here for soccer. And I'm also guessing, though, that our buddy David Lammy is probably getting a lot of calls from Dubai being like, we got to work this out.
Yeah. I mean, to me, it's like a broader question about like what happens when you, when you open the door to this kind of foreign ownership of like iconic sports franchises, which we've seen in soccer. But like, it's an interesting question of what the, you know, Gulf countries, UAE in particular, what their clout is inside the UK. We've seen, you know, was it in Newcastle that with the Saudis?
Yep. Saudis bought the team.
Saudis bought. So like they my advice to the British government is like use this case to try to set some parameters around, you know, what the nature of foreign ownership is and what the kind of rules are and guardrails you put around it. And then, how do you resist the overwhelming influence that these countries have? Because these countries invest in the UK, right? So there's, they could be threatening to withhold certain things. But the other thing I'd say, Tommy, is that this might become an issue in the US.
Definitely.
We don't have the same level of foreign ownership, but as the valuation of sports franchises go up, right? So NBA franchises are now worth several $1 billion, and that could keep going up. NFL teams, God only knows how much they're worth. There's going to be a temptation to start letting foreign governments, foreign sovereign wealth funds, foreign individuals buy up teams. We should be looking at this too as we consider, okay, on the one end, you want to have robust financing for how these leagues operate. But what you don't want is a situation where it gets skewed and some, it's like a plaything of somebody with like a, unlimited money to just come in and kind of distort your league. Yeah. And so I think the U.S. sports leagues should be looking at this too as they consider, future arrangements themselves.
Yeah, I mean, this has been a real problem in soccer because you have Man City that was owned by, these guys out of the UAE. You have Paris Saint-Germain in a different league over in France, but they were owned by Qatar. Yeah. You had Chelsea that was owned by a Russian oligarch for a long time. So they were sort of
the Russian oligarch,
Roman Abramovich.
Yeah,
so they're kind of awash in sort of shady fucking money.
Yeah.
In the U.S., it's homegrown domestic assholes like Jerry Jones, who owns the Dallas Cowboys. But he bought the Cowboys for $150 million, and now it's worth $10 billion.
Yeah.
So the NFL recently
So if he ever wants to sell it, right?
Right.
Who can buy that?
That's exactly right. The NFL had to change rules to allow private equity to be involved in the ownership of these teams. They have not allowed sovereign wealth funds, as far as I can tell, to come into buying these teams. But at some point, you're right, no one else can afford them.
I guarantee you that's going to be creeping into the picture, because who else can put together a group? I mean, it used to be like you put together a group of like the local business.
Yeah, like Robert
Titans.
Kraft.
Yeah.
Patriots
Those days
owner.
are gone. Well,
You got that big
massage scandal. But
you got Woody Johnson, that big pharma money.
We got the Trumpy MAGA. That's another reason why the Jets are like below the Knicks and the Mets. In my, I like our hedge fund guy, Mets owner, just because he spent some money. Although he's, I think, a little Trumpy too. And then we got James Dolan, who's the Knicks have gotten noticeably better since he poured his heart and soul and probably all of his money into the Sphere. Because he took his eye off the operations of the Knicks, and all of a sudden, lo and behold, we're good again. But
I do want to see the Grateful Dead there if they go back. And
I
just
fucking missed that, man.
crush some
I
mushrooms.
wanted to see Dead and Company there. Yeah,
we should do that together. We should
do
maybe
that.
record a pod from the back.
Yeah, we should.
Just a bootleg.
Just a little, just a little psilocybin exercise.
Just a little journey. We'll just talk about.
Take a little journey.
Talk about this. The NSA pod, our next topic.
Yeah.
I do love that you guys have the Johnson & Johnson owner and the anti-vax quarterback over in the Jets.
I've got the ownership. I mean, before Steve Cohen bought the Mets, it was the Wilpon family who basically were like Bernie Madoff's. Like they lost all their money with Bernie Madoff.
Ooh.
So we had just had the worst fucking owners. Imagine sports. What happened to good sports? I guess maybe were there ever good sports owners? I don't know.
I don't know either.
I mean, I grew up with George Steinbrenner.
The Steelers.
Yes, some of the best people.
The Rooneys.
Let's just pay tribute to the Rooneys.
Love the Rooneys,
including our first ambassador to Ireland. Rooneys, great family.
A fantastic guy.
Yeah.
I've got to know a lot of them actually. They're a very nice family.
Great family.
All right, Ben. Well, that was a nice ending to a tough segment. But two more things here. So this first one is just a reminder that we have got to be on our game at all times because there is growing competition in the podcast space. This time it's a very well-financed competitor called the NSA, the National Security Agency. They have a new podcast. It is called No Such Podcast, which is a play on the NSA's nickname, No Such Agency. Haha. The goal, I think, is for them to take a little victory lap for its successes, staffing, their technical prowess. Here's a clip from the trailer.
It's not the kind of story you hear every day, where success is the attack that never happened, the lives that weren't lost. It's not the kind of story we tell every day. For decades, we served in silence. NSA seemed to stand for no such agency, but behind that silence, service.
I like the music.
Where's that music come from?
Is that like a violin? Just get Shomik to do that for us.
I mean, they're constantly worried over there at the NSA about the fact that, the kinds of people that they want to hire can make just fucking gobs of money working for hedge funds,
Yeah, that's gotta be
helping
hard.
game the markets, or
Tech
working for
community.
tech, open AI type companies. But so I'm wondering the brainstorm where where like the podcast is gonna.
Yeah.
It's not like there's guys sitting in like Stanford and MIT dorm rooms probably. We got some worldos probably there, but I'm not sure that they're gonna reach the audience. But more power to them. I'm glad, join the podcast industry.
I haven't listened yet. I was reminded by the story. That
Do you think Hims will be an advertiser? Sorry, but I had to take that out. But
leave it in.
Yeah.
That would be that's more actually for the CIA's pod. I was reminded that they have 3 seasons now of the CIA pod. I've listened to Don. I should give it a shot. There might be some cool stories in there. What were we talking about? You said something funny. Fuck. Oh my God, that made me laugh so hard. I mean, there is.
It'd be funny if the ads. Wait, let's stick with this for a second. If it was like Lockheed Martin, and like Raytheon,
Simply Safe, protect your home from intruders and NSA. Yeah, I mean, listen. But so when I left the White House in 2013, before Crooked Media, Favreau and I did like speechwriting consulting stuff, and there was a period of time where like everyone you talked to was like, "What's our ice bucket challenge?"
Yeah,
and you wanted to blow your brains out.
Yeah.
I think there was a period of time where I think every comm shop thought they needed a podcast, which is when the CIA launched theirs in 2022. I'm not sure we might be post podcast boom.
Yeah.
So again, I haven't listened to these yet. I mean, there's an open question of like how effective this kind of internal communications thing can be. Usually the government is so risk averse that it ends up being not interesting, but I don't know.
They should have like Snowden on, like if they want to get some, they're going to catch some attention.
That'd be a big get.
Yeah, their booking should be like non-traditional.
Greenwald.
Yeah, Greenwald. Yeah. Like a
Jim Risen.
4-part series with Glenn Greenwald.
Just ACLU debates. Yeah. I mean, hell, I'd listen to that.
Yeah, I'd listen to,
I'd listen to all of that.
Yeah, Glenn Greenwald.
Or they're just going to like tap our phones and release that as a podcast.
Well, that'd be actually. What if they had declassified one piece of salacious intelligence each podcast? So you think it's boring, then all of a sudden they're like, and here's
they just go full page 6, release like the name of some leader and who they're sleeping with.
Or they could just use it to actually, you know what? I mean, now we're in a brainstorm here. Like you declassify Russian intelligence.
That
like
you could do.
Yeah.
It would have to be old shit though, right? 25 years,
I don't
50
know.
years.
We're in a brave new world, right? Like,
you want to do some modern stuff?
A little release.
Do it by pod?
Yeah.
Okay. Free idea, NSA.
Yeah. Here's what some Russian oligarchs are partying, and on their yachts,
Ooh, yeah. You could do one just about best oligarch yacht names.
Yeah. Yeah. And some signals intelligence on, well, I shouldn't even speculate who we have signals intelligence on, but,
Fair enough.
Yeah.
Okay, good brainstorm. Finally, Ben, speaking of brainstorms by the intelligence community, so we've talked a lot about kind of various creative intel gathering efforts by foreign adversaries. Iran sending phishing scams to the Trump and Harris campaigns. Apparently they're effective, but we've never seen those documents. There was report that North Korea is infiltrating IT companies in the U.S. to get in the back door. You got Chinese hacks on American infrastructure. But did you know that potentially the greatest intelligence tool and feat in history might have been Pokémon GO?
Yes.
So our source here, it's a Belarusian defense ministry official who went on a podcast, was it the NSA podcast, and said that at the height of the game's popularity, the most Pokemon were located at a Belarusian airbase, and he believes that it was a Western intelligence plot. This guy's name was Alexander Ivanov. He said, quote, on the territory of the 50th airbase where the runway is, where there's a lot of military aviation equipment, that's where there were the most Pokemon. Is this not intelligent information? Did we Pokemon go down to Langley? Is that what happened?
I just don't understand this. I saw this story and and you have, you're like Lizzie will get a little older. Pokemon's. I love Pokemon because I love the kind of, weird Asian vibe. But what this reveals is kind of the guys like Lukashenko, right, who runs Belarus, who's like locks up his opposition. These are such fucking weirdos, right? It's like a Tim Waltz thing, like these cryptic, tyrannical guys who think that they've figured out that the Western interference plot is Pokemon. Give me a break, man.
It's a little paranoid. Do we think Alexander Ivanov had the best handle on this sort of aggregate location of Pokemon monsters?
Yeah, I don't even get where's he getting this information from? Like, you know, how are they measuring this Pokemon phenomenon in Belarus? You know,
remember there was a freak.
Maybe there's just some kid who's really into fucking Pokemon cards. And
yeah, the game came out. Everyone was. I never played it, to be honest. Everyone was freak playing it. Mostly it was like, you know, hipsters running around Brooklyn playing Pokemon Go. But there was some concern at one point that everyone was kind of uploading to a corporation like the internal specs of all their living spaces. You remember that? There was a bit of a freak out over that. I don't know that freak out went anywhere.
I guess, I mean, to be fair to Alexander Ivanov, you know, anything can be an intelligence gathering tool, you know.
Yeah.
But it is just, you know,
including pagers, we've learned.
Yeah. Well, yeah, there's that. But you know, I don't know. A Pokemon, maybe just chill out a little bit. Let the kids play the Pokemon Go. You know,
Pokemon go to the polls.
Yeah,
it's a tough day in our politics. That's all I got. You got any other stories you want to talk about?
No, that was good. I think we really covered the waterfront there in a healthy way.
All right. Well, we're gonna take. I'm not going to take a break. That's going to be it for us.
That's it. Yeah, no interview today.
And then we had no interview because we had a lot to talk about.
We had a lot to talk about.
But
we have to get it off.
Thank you all for tuning in.
By the way, the Patriots are better than I thought they'd be.
Yeah, we're okay.
You should have won the last.
We should have beat Seattle.
Yeah.
We're not starting our rookie quarterback yet, which is maybe long-term good, but Jacoby Brissett's probably not going to take us to the playoffs.
I dig guys like that, though. They just never seem to leave the NFL.
Yeah.
You know, like they just...
Yeah. I think we drafted him, too, in like 2016
we
or something.
We drafted Geno Smith, who was the Seahawks quarterback, who, you know, is one of the better quarterbacks in the league now.
Playing well.
Yeah.
Go Geno.
That's how it goes for the Jets. Yeah.
All right, well, see you Thursday night.
See you.